Alira woke before dawn to the sound of a fist pounding on the thin wooden door of the servant quarters. She did not need to guess who it was. Only one voice in the Voss household carried that much impatience before the sun had even risen. "Get up," the voice snapped. "The mistress wants the East Hall cleaned before breakfast, and you are already behind." Alira rose from the narrow cot without a word. Speaking back was not allowed, not even a simple good morning. She had learned that lesson within her first week in this house. 3 years ago, when a single sentence spoken out of turn had earned her a week of double chores and no evening meal. Since then, she had trained herself to move through the house like a shadow, silent and unnoticed, doing exactly what was asked and nothing more. She splashed cold water on her face from the basin in the corner, tied back her long brown hair, and pulled on the gray servant's dress that had been handed to her the day she arrived. It was thin and patched at the elbows, but it was the only dress she owned. She did not remember the last time anyone had asked her what she wanted to wear, or what she wanted to eat, or what she wanted at all. Her name had not always been a whisper in this house. Once, she had been Alira, daughter of a modest hunter named Callum, living in a small village near the southern border. Life there had never been easy. The winters were long, the harvests were thin, and her father's debts had piled higher every year after her mother passed. But there had been warmth once. There had been a small fire in a small home, and a father who, despite his failures, had once looked at her like she mattered. That had ended the day 2 men in fine coats arrived at their door, carrying papers and a heavy pouch of coins. Alira had been 17 then, sweeping the front step, when she heard her father's voice crack in a way she had never heard before. She had stepped inside to see him staring at the coins on the table, his hands trembling, unable to meet her eyes. "I have no choice," he had told her later that night, his voice barely above a whisper. "The debt collectors will take everything. They will take the house. They will take our land. This is the only way to keep your brothers fed." Alira had not screamed. She had not begged. She had simply stood there, feeling the floor shift beneath her, as her father explained that she would be going to live with the Voss family, a wealthy household 2 days' journey north, in exchange for enough coin to clear every debt he owed. It was, he said, a common arrangement among struggling families. It was, he said, temporary. It was, he said, the only way. She had believed him. For a while, she had told herself that perhaps the Voss household would treat her fairly, that perhaps this was simply a season of hardship she would one day look back on as a difficult chapter in an otherwise ordinary life. But 3 years had passed since that night, and nothing about her circumstances had changed. If anything, they had grown harder. The Voss estate was a sprawling manor, built from pale stone, with tall windows and manicured gardens, that Alira was allowed to tend, but never allowed to enjoy. The family who lived there were among the wealthiest in the northern provinces, their fortune built on trade routes and old alliances. To outsiders, they were gracious hosts and generous benefactors. Behind closed doors, they were something else entirely. Lord Aldrich Voss rarely spoke to Alira directly, treating her as little more than furniture that occasionally needed instructions. His wife, Lady Voss, was colder still, quick to criticize and slow to forgive even the smallest mistake. But it was their daughter, Marisol, who made Alira's days the hardest to bear. Marisol was 19, beautiful in the way that wealth made effortless, and cruel in a way that boredom often bred. She had taken an instant dislike to Alira from the very first day, perhaps sensing something in the quiet servant girl that unsettled her, though she could never quite name what it was. Over the years, that dislike had hardened into something sharper. "You missed a spot," Marisol said that morning, standing in the doorway of the East Hall with her arms crossed, watching Alira scrub the stone floor on her knees. "Do it again." Alira did not argue. She dipped the cloth back into the bucket of cold water and began again, ignoring the ache in her back and the chill creeping into her fingers. She had learned that resistance only made things worse. Silence was safer. Silence was survival. As she worked, her sleeve slipped slightly, revealing a small crescent-shaped mark on the inside of her wrist, pale against her skin, almost silver in certain light. She pulled the fabric back down quickly, an old habit born of an old fear. The village elder back home had once told her, when she was very young, that a mark like hers was a sign of something unnatural, something to be hidden rather than celebrated. She had never questioned it. She had simply learned to keep her sleeves long and her wrist covered, no matter the season. She did not know that the mark she hid so carefully was not a curse at all, but the opposite. She did not know that far to the north, in a kingdom she had never seen and could barely imagine, a king had spent more than a decade searching for a girl with exactly that mark. By midday, Alira had finished the East Hall, scrubbed the kitchen floors, and carried in enough firewood to last the household through the evening. Her hands were raw, her knees bruised from the stone, but she said nothing of it to anyone. There was no one to say it to. The other servants in the house kept to themselves, wary of drawing Marisol's attention, and Elira had long since stopped expecting kindness from anyone within these walls. She ate her meal alone in the small pantry off the kitchen, a heel of bread and a bit of cheese, while listening to the muffled sounds of laughter from the dining hall, where the Voss family entertained guests almost every evening. Sometimes she wondered what it might feel like to sit at a table like that, to be spoken to with warmth instead of command. She no longer allowed herself to wonder for long. Hope, she had learned, was a dangerous thing to carry in a house like this. That evening, as she cleared dishes from the dining hall after the guests had gone, she overheard Lord Voss speaking quietly with his wife near the fireplace. "There is word from the north," he said, his voice low. "The Alpha King's men have been asking questions in the southern villages again. Something about a mark, a symbol from the old stories." "Let them ask," Lady Voss replied dismissively. "It has nothing to do with us." Elira paused for only a moment, her arms full of plates, before continuing her work. The words meant nothing to her then. She had no reason to think they ever would. She finished clearing the hall, extinguished the candles, and returned to the small servant quarters where she slept, her body exhausted, her mind quiet, unaware that somewhere far beyond the walls of the Voss estate, a search that had lasted a lifetime was slowly, steadily drawing closer to her door. She lay awake for a while that night, staring at the low ceiling above her cot, listening to the wind move through the trees outside. She thought of her father, wondering if he ever regretted the choice he made, wondering if her younger brothers still remembered her face. She thought of the crescent mark on her wrist, hidden now beneath her sleeve, and wondered, not for the first time, what it truly meant. She did not know that the answer to that question would change everything. Elira closed her eyes and let sleep take her, unaware that her life, which had felt so small and so fixed for so long, was about to be pulled entirely off its course, unaware that a king who had never stopped searching was closer than he had ever been, unaware that the quiet, careful existence she had built for herself inside the walls of a cruel household was, without her knowing it, already beginning to end. Far to the north, beyond forests thick with pine and rivers that never fully froze, stood the stone city of Ashwin, seat of the Northern Territories and home to its ruling family. At the heart of the city rose a fortress of dark granite, its towers overlooking the valley below, and within its walls lived a man who had everything a kingdom could offer, yet felt as though he possessed nothing at all. King Draven Ashgrove was 32 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of quiet authority that made rooms fall silent the moment he entered them. He had ruled the Northern Territories for 11 years, since the sudden passing of his father, and in that time, he had built alliances, strengthened borders, and earned the respect of every pack leader from the coast to the mountains. By every measure that mattered to the kingdom, he was a successful king. By every measure that mattered to him personally, he was still incomplete. It began when he was a boy of 6, long before he understood what dreams meant, or why some of them lingered longer than others. He remembered waking in the middle of the night, his small heart racing, certain that he had just seen someone important, though he could never recall a face. As he grew older, the dream sharpened. A young girl, always slightly out of reach, always turning away just before he could see her clearly. And on her wrist, every single time, a pale crescent mark that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness of the dream. His mother had been the first to take the dream seriously. She had been a wise woman, deeply connected to the old traditions of their people, and she recognized the signs long before Draven did. "That is no ordinary dream," she told him once, when he was perhaps 12 years old, sitting beside her in the castle library. "That is the pull of a fated bond. Somewhere in this world there is someone meant for you, someone your spirit already knows, even if your mind has not yet met her." Draven had not fully believed her then. He was young, and the idea of a fated mate felt more like an old story told to comfort restless children than something real. But the dreams did not fade as he grew older. If anything, they grew stronger, more vivid, more insistent, especially during the long nights after his father's death, when the weight of ruling alone settled onto his shoulders for the first time. By the time he was 25, Draven had turned away 3 arranged matches presented to him by neighboring pack leaders, each one a political alliance dressed up as a courtship. His advisors had grown frustrated, worried that a king without an heir was a king vulnerable to challenge. But Draven refused to bind himself to someone who was not the one his instincts had been pointing toward since childhood. "I am not being stubborn for the sake of it," he told his closest advisor, an older man named Eldon who had served the royal family for decades. "I feel her. I have felt her for years. I cannot explain it in a way that will satisfy a council meeting, but I know she is out there, and I know she is real." Eldon, who had seen many strange things in his long service to the crown, did not argue. Instead, he helped Draven organize something the kingdom had never attempted before: a quiet, methodical search across every province and territory for any trace of a girl bearing a crescent-shaped mark on her wrist. It was slow work. The northern territories were vast, stretching from icy coastlines to dense southern forests, and the population scattered across hundreds of villages and towns. Draven's scouts traveled disguised as merchants, healers, and traders, careful not to draw attention to their true purpose. A king searching openly for a specific mark would only invite danger, both for himself and for the girl they sought. Should rival houses learn of her importance before Draven could reach her? Years passed. Reports came in occasionally, rumors of marked children in distant villages, but each lead eventually dissolved into nothing. A birthmark that resembled a crescent but was too faint, too large, too different in shape. Draven grew accustomed to disappointment, though he never allowed himself to fully give up hope. His most trusted general, a sharp and steady man named Corin, had been with him through nearly every stage of the search. Corin had grown from a young soldier into Draven's closest confidant, and it was Corin who insisted, year after year, that the search continue even when the council grew weary of funding it. "A king needs an heir," one council member argued during a particularly tense meeting, only a year before the events that would finally change everything. "The Northern Alliance grows nervous each season you remain unmarried. Perhaps it is time to consider that the dreams were simply dreams." Draven had remained calm, though his voice carried an edge of steel. "I have led this kingdom for 11 years without fault. I have kept peace on our borders and prosperity in our markets. I am not asking the council to fund fantasy. I am asking for patience, because I know, without question, that she exists." The council had reluctantly agreed to continue limited support for the search, though privately, several of them believed the king's conviction was beginning to resemble obsession rather than certainty. It was Corin who finally brought new information forward, arriving at the castle late one evening with dust still clinging to his boots from days of hard travel. "There is talk," Corin said, standing before Draven in the private study, "of a girl in the southern provinces, near the Voss estate, said to always wear long sleeves regardless of the season. One of the household staff, a woman who left their service last year, mentioned it to a trader in passing. She said the girl hides something on her wrist and reacts with fear whenever anyone comes close to seeing it." Draven had gone very still at those words, the same stillness that came over him whenever the dreams returned particularly strong the night before. "The Voss estate," he repeated quietly. "I know that name. A wealthy trading family, not particularly known for warmth toward those in their service." "No," Corin agreed. "Not known for warmth at all." Draven's jaw tightened, an old protective instinct rising in him even before he had confirmed anything. "Go there yourself, quietly. I do not want anyone connected to the crown drawing attention to this girl until we know for certain. If she is who I believe she is, and if she has spent years under the roof of a household with a reputation like that one, then I want to know everything before I act." Corin bowed and left within the hour, traveling south under the disguise of a traveling merchant dealing in northern textiles, a cover he had used successfully many times before. Draven remained in his study long after Corin's departure, staring out the tall window toward the dark tree line beyond the castle walls, his heart caught somewhere between hope and dread. He thought of the dream again that night, the same one that had visited him since childhood. The girl turning away, always just out of reach, the crescent mark glowing faintly in the dark. For the first time in years, the dream did not feel distant. It felt close, as though the girl on the other side of it had somehow moved nearer while he slept. He did not sleep again that night. Instead, he stood at the window until dawn broke over the mountains, thinking of a girl he had never met but had somehow known his entire life, wondering if the years of searching were finally about to end. Life inside the Voss estate followed the same rigid pattern day after day, and Alira had long since stopped expecting anything to break that pattern. She woke before the sun, worked until well past dark, and fell asleep too exhausted to dream. It was a life measured in tasks rather than moments, in chores completed rather than time enjoyed, and she had learned to survive it by simply refusing to think too far ahead. The other servants in the household kept a careful distance from her, not out of unkindness exactly, but out of caution. Marisol's dislike of Alira had become well known among the staff, and none of them wanted to risk being associated with someone who so often drew the young mistress's irritation. Only one person in the household showed Alira any real warmth, an older cook named Greta, who had worked for the Voss family for over 20 years, and had seen enough hardship in her own life to recognize it in someone else. "Sit," Greta told her one evening, pulling out a stool near the kitchen fire while the rest of the household settled in for the night. "You look like you have not eaten properly in days." Elira hesitated, glancing toward the doorway out of old habit, checking for anyone who might report her for resting when she should be working. Greta noticed and waved a dismissive hand. "No one is coming. The mistress and her daughter are entertaining guests in the drawing room. We have a moment of peace. Eat." Elira sat, grateful for the warmth of the fire and the simple bowl of stew Greta placed in front of her. It was one of the few kindnesses she allowed herself to accept, mostly because Greta never asked questions, never pried into Elira's past, and never made her feel smaller than she already felt most days. "You have been here 3 years now," Greta said, stirring a pot over the fire without looking up. "I remember the day you arrived. You barely spoke a word for the first month." "There was nothing to say," Elira replied quietly. Greta glanced at her then, something soft and knowing in her expression. "There is always something to say, child. Sometimes people simply learn it is safer to stay silent." Elira did not answer, focusing instead on her meal, though Greta's words settled somewhere deep inside her, a truth she had never spoken aloud but had always known. The following days brought little change, though Elira noticed a subtle shift in the household's mood. Lord Voss had been receiving more visitors than usual, well-dressed men who arrived in fine carriages and spoke with him behind closed doors for hours at a time. Elira paid little attention to the details of their conversations, focused as she always was on completing her tasks without drawing attention, but she could not help overhearing fragments here and there as she moved through the halls with trays of food and drink. "The northern search continues," one visitor mentioned during a private meeting Elira happened to pass while carrying a tray of tea. "The Alpha King has not slowed his efforts, despite the council's growing impatience." "A stubborn man, chasing dreams," Lord Voss replied, his tone dismissive. "Though I suppose a king can afford such indulgences." Elira had continued down the hall without pausing, the words meaning little to her at the time. Kings and kingdoms belonged to a world entirely separate from her own small, narrow existence within these walls. She had no reason to imagine that the search Lord Voss spoke of so casually had anything to do with her. Marisol's cruelty, meanwhile, seemed to sharpen with each passing week, as though she sensed some unnamed change in the air, and wished to remind Elira of her place before anything could shift. It began with small things, extra chores added without warning, meals delayed until the food had gone cold, but it grew more pointed as the days passed. "You will scrub the entire west wing tonight," Marisol announced one afternoon, finding Elira in the garden where she had been trimming hedges. "All of it, before you sleep." "The west wing has not been used in months," Elira said carefully, immediately regretting the words the moment they left her mouth. Marisol's eyes narrowed. "Are you questioning me?" "No," Elira said quickly, lowering her gaze. "I will begin right away." Marisol studied her for a long moment, something calculating behind her eyes, before turning and walking away without another word. Elira exhaled slowly, her heart still pounding from the brief exchange, and set down her shears to begin the long night of work ahead of her. It was well past midnight by the time she finished scrubbing the abandoned rooms of the west wing, her hands raw and her back aching from hours bent over stone floors. She made her way back toward the servant quarters through the quiet, dark halls of the estate, moving carefully so as not to wake anyone, when she noticed a faint light coming from beneath the door of Lord Voss's private study. She should have continued past it, she knew that. But something made her slow her steps, curiosity overtaking caution for just a moment, as she caught a fragment of conversation drifting through the gap beneath the door. "A mark on her wrist, they say," a voice she did not recognize was saying, "crescent-shaped. The old stories claim it marks a fated bond to the northern bloodline." "There are many marks in this world," Lord Voss replied, his tone carefully neutral. "Most mean nothing." "And if this one means something," the visitor pressed, "the reward for information leading to the girl would be significant. The Alpha King has offered generous terms to anyone who assists in the search." There was a long pause before Lord Voss spoke again, his voice lower now, harder to make out. Elira strained to hear, her pulse quickening for reasons she could not fully explain, though something deep inside her had gone very still. "I have no such girl in my household," Lord Voss said finally. "You are wasting your time here." Elira did not wait to hear more. She hurried back toward the servant quarters, her heart racing, her mind spinning with questions she did not know how to answer. A crescent mark. A fated bond, the northern bloodline. She thought of her own wrist, hidden as always beneath her sleeve, and felt a cold shiver move through her that had nothing to do with the late hour or the chill in the halls. She told herself it meant nothing. Marks like hers were common enough, surely. There was no reason to believe the conversation she had overheard had anything to do with her own life. And yet, as she lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling above her narrow cot, she could not shake the strange, unfamiliar feeling that something in her quiet, careful world had just begun, ever so slightly, to shift. She pressed her sleeve down over her wrist out of old habit, though no one was there to see it, and closed her eyes, willing sleep to come, unaware that the conversation she had just overheard was only the very beginning of everything that was about to change. Corin arrived in the southern town nearest the Voss estate 3 days after leaving the capital, his cart loaded with bolts of fine northern cloth, his manner relaxed and unremarkable, exactly as he intended. Years of quiet missions for the crown had taught him how to disappear into a role, how to ask questions without seeming to ask them at all, and how to read a town's rhythms within a single afternoon of walking its streets. The town itself was modest but prosperous, benefiting from its proximity to the Voss estate, which employed a significant portion of the local population in one capacity or another. Corin set up a small stall near the market square, displaying his cloth alongside a handful of other trinkets meant to establish his cover, and began the slow, careful work of listening. "Fine cloth, is it?" an older woman asked, running her fingers over a bolt of deep blue fabric. "Not often we see northern goods this far south." "Business has been good this season," Corin replied easily, "though I confess I am also here on a personal matter. I am looking for information about a household in the area, the Voss estate. I understand they are a significant family in this region." The woman's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something guarded crossing her face. "Significant, yes. Kind, not particularly." Corin kept his tone light, curious rather than pressing. "I have heard rumors that they keep a large staff. I wonder if you might know anyone who has worked there, perhaps someone I could speak with about their household." The woman glanced around before leaning in slightly. "My niece worked there for a time, years ago now. She left as soon as she could manage it. Said the young mistress was cruel to the servants, especially one girl in particular, a quiet one who came to them as payment for a debt." Corin's pulse quickened, though he kept his expression carefully neutral. "A debt, you say? That must have been difficult for the girl." "Difficult is a gentle word for it, from what I understand," the woman said, shaking her head. "My niece said the girl barely spoke, kept to herself, always wore long sleeves no matter how warm the weather. Strange thing to notice, but my niece mentioned it more than once." Corin purchased a small trinket from the woman as thanks for her time, careful not to seem too eager, and continued his slow walk through the market square, gathering fragments of information from other vendors and townspeople throughout the day. By evening, a clearer picture had begun to form. A girl, sold into service at the Voss estate roughly 3 years earlier, always concealing her wrists, enduring particular harshness from the household's daughter. It was not proof. Corin knew better than to mistake rumor for certainty, but it was enough to warrant closer investigation, and he spent the following days finding reasons to remain in the area, visiting the market regularly, striking up conversations with anyone connected to the estate, careful never to ask too directly about the girl herself. He learned her name eventually, mentioned in passing by a delivery driver who supplied grain to the estate's kitchens, Elira. A simple name, unremarkable on its own, but Corin found himself repeating it quietly to himself that evening as he made notes in the small journal he carried, cross-referencing what little he had gathered against the description Draven had shared with him so many times over the years. A girl with a crescent mark on her wrist, a girl who hid it out of fear rather than pride, a girl who had endured years of hardship without complaint, because complaint had never once been permitted. Corin knew he needed more than rumor before reporting anything back to the king. Draven had waited too long, hoped too hard, for Corin to raise expectations based on second-hand gossip from a market stall. He needed to see her himself, if only from a distance, to confirm even the smallest detail that might connect this quiet servant girl to the dream that had haunted his king since childhood. His opportunity came nearly a week into his stay, when he learned that servants from the Voss estate occasionally traveled into town on errands for the household, always accompanied by a member of the estate staff to ensure they returned promptly. Corin arranged his stall near the main square each morning after that, watching carefully for any sign of a young woman matching the description he had gathered. He almost missed her the first time she appeared, moving quickly and quietly through the market with a basket balanced against her hip, her head down, her sleeves pulled low over her wrists despite the warmth of the afternoon sun. She purchased what she needed with brief, efficient exchanges, never lingering, never meeting the eyes of anyone around her, and Corin found himself studying her from behind his stall with a growing, cautious sense of certainty. She matched every detail he had gathered. The quiet manner, the long sleeves, the careful, guarded way she moved through a crowd, as though trying to take up as little space as possible in the world around her. But it was not until she paused near a fruit vendor, reaching up to adjust a stray strand of hair that had escaped its tie, that Corin caught the briefest glimpse of pale skin as her sleeve slipped down her raised arm. He could not be entirely certain from that distance, but he thought, for just a moment, that he saw the faint curve of a mark against her wrist before she quickly pulled her sleeve back into place and continued on her way. Corin did not follow her directly, aware that drawing attention to himself now could jeopardize everything. Instead, he watched her make her way back toward the road leading to the Voss estate, memorizing the details of her appearance, her manner, the careful way she carried herself through a world that had clearly taught her caution above all else. That evening, Corin sat by the fire in the small inn where he had been staying, staring into the flames as he composed his report in his mind before committing it to paper. He thought of the years Draven had spent searching, the disappointments, the growing doubts of the council, the quiet, unwavering certainty his king had carried through it all despite everything. He thought too of the girl he had glimpsed that afternoon, the careful way she had moved through the market as though trying to remain invisible, the guarded manner that spoke of years spent learning to expect very little kindness from the world around her. If she truly was the one Draven had been searching for, Corin thought, then the years ahead would need to be gentler to her than the years behind her had been. He resolved, as he finally began writing his report to send back to the capital, that whatever came next, he would do everything in his power to ensure that was exactly what happened. He sealed the letter before dawn and sent it north by his fastest rider, then began preparing quietly for what he suspected would be the king's swift and immediate response. Alira had not noticed the merchant watching her that day in the market, too focused on completing her errands quickly and returning to the estate before Marisol noticed her absence had run even a moment too long. She had grown so accustomed to moving through the world unseen that the idea of anyone paying particular attention to her had long since stopped occurring to her at all. She returned to the estate that afternoon with her basket full of the items Lady Voss had requested, delivering them to the kitchen where Greta was already preparing the evening meal. "You took your time," Greta observed, though her tone carried no real accusation, simply an old habit of watching over the younger servant in whatever small ways she could manage. "The market was busy," Alira replied, setting the basket down carefully. "There was a merchant selling northern cloth, quite fine, from what I could see." "Northern cloth," Greta repeated, arching an eyebrow. "Expensive, then. Not the sort of thing this household purchases from a market stall." Alira shrugged, already moving to help with the evening preparations, her mind elsewhere, unaware of how close she had come to being noticed by someone whose presence in that market square was anything but ordinary. The days that followed continued in their usual rhythm, though Alira found herself thinking, more than she had in a long while, about the conversation she had overheard outside Lord Voss's study. A crescent mark, a fated bond, the northern bloodline. She had told herself repeatedly that it meant nothing, that marks like hers were common enough, that there was no reason to believe any of it connected to her own quiet, unremarkable life. And yet, late one evening, alone in the servant quarters, she found herself pulling back her sleeve and studying the mark on her wrist more closely than she had in years. It was small, pale, curved like a crescent moon, faintly visible against her skin even in the dim candlelight. She had always been taught to view it as something shameful, something to hide, but as she studied it now, she could not help but wonder, for the first time in her life, whether that had ever truly been the right way to see it. She quickly pulled her sleeve back down, unsettled by her own thoughts, and forced herself to focus on sleep instead. There was no use dwelling on old fears and older superstitions. Whatever the mark meant, it had brought her nothing but caution and concealment for as long as she could remember, and she saw no reason to believe that would change now. Meanwhile, far to the north, Draven received Corin's letter 3 days after it was sent, the fastest rider in the kingdom having ridden through 2 full nights to deliver it without delay. Draven read the report standing in his private study, his hands gripping the parchment tightly as he absorbed every detail Corin had gathered. A girl named Alira, sold into service at the Voss estate 3 years earlier to settle a family debt. Quiet, guarded, always concealing her wrists, a possible glimpse of a mark, though not fully confirmed. Draven set the letter down slowly, his heart pounding in a way it had not in years, not since the earliest days of his search when every rumor still carried the full weight of possibility, before repeated disappointment had taught him to guard his hope more carefully. He summoned Eldon immediately, the older advisor arriving within minutes, still adjusting his robes from where he had been roused from evening rest. "Corin has found her," Draven said without preamble, holding the letter out. "Or believes he has. A girl at the Voss estate, sold into service years ago, matching every detail we have gathered over the years. Eldon read the letter carefully, his expression thoughtful as he absorbed the details. The Voss household, he said slowly, not known for kindness toward those in their service, from what I have heard over the years. I am aware, Draven said, his jaw tightening, which is exactly why I intend to go there myself, as soon as arrangements can be made. Your Majesty, Eldon said carefully, a king traveling personally to a minor household in the southern provinces will draw significant attention. If this girl truly carries the mark you have searched for, we must consider how best to protect her from any complications that might arise from a sudden public claim. Draven exhaled slowly, forcing himself to think beyond the immediate pull of urgency, though every instinct in him wanted to ride south that very night. Then we will not announce the true purpose of the visit. I will travel under the guise of a diplomatic tour of the southern provinces, strengthening alliances with regional households. The Voss estate will simply be one stop among several, nothing that draws particular suspicion. Eldon nodded slowly. That is wise. It will take time to arrange properly, perhaps 2 weeks to establish a believable itinerary without raising questions. 2 weeks, Draven repeated, the words tasting bitter after 11 years of searching. But he knew Eldon was right. A hasty, poorly planned approach could endanger the very girl he sought to protect, drawing unwanted attention from rival houses or exposing her to further hardship before he could reach her safely. 2 weeks, he agreed finally, but not a day longer. Over the following days, preparations moved forward with careful precision. Eldon arranged a diplomatic itinerary spanning several southern households, ensuring the Voss estate appeared as simply one stop among many, rather than the true destination it represented. Draven, meanwhile, found himself unable to focus fully on the affairs of state that continued to demand his attention, his mind repeatedly drifting toward the girl Corin had described, the quiet servant hiding a mark that might finally end a search that had defined so much of his life. He dreamed of her again the night before his departure, the same dream that had visited him since childhood, though this time something felt different. The girl did not turn away as she always had before. For just a moment, she seemed to pause, as though sensing something drawing near, before the dream dissolved into morning light. Draven woke before dawn, dressed in traveling clothes rather than his usual formal attire, and made his way to the castle courtyard where Corin waited alongside a modest escort of guards, deliberately kept small to avoid drawing excessive attention. Are you certain about this? Eldon asked one final time, standing beside the king's horse as the party prepared to depart. Draven looked toward the southern road, the same road that would lead him, after 11 years of searching, dreaming, and refusing to give up hope, toward a small estate where a girl he had never met but had somehow always known was waiting, unaware that her entire world was about to change. I have never been more certain of anything, Draven said quietly, before mounting his horse and giving the signal to ride. The journey south took 9 days, longer than Draven would have liked, but necessary to maintain the careful pretense of a diplomatic tour rather than an urgent personal mission. At each household along the route, Draven forced himself to sit through formal dinners and lengthy discussions of trade agreements, his mind constantly drifting toward the final stop on their itinerary, though he never allowed his impatience to show. Corin rode beside him for much of the journey, having returned briefly to the capital to accompany the royal party south, providing additional details he had gathered during his time near the Voss estate. The household staff describe her as hard-working and quiet, Corin said one evening as they made camp along the road, never causing trouble, never drawing attention to herself. From what I could gather, that has been her way of surviving under their roof. And the daughter, Draven said, his voice carefully controlled, though Corin could hear the tension beneath it, the one known for her cruelty. Marisol Voss, Corin confirmed. By all accounts, she has made the girl's years there particularly difficult. Extra chores, harsh words, little kindness. The cook seems to be the only one in that household who shows her any genuine warmth. Draven said nothing for a long moment, staring into the fire, his hands clenched loosely at his sides. He had known, from the moment Corin's first letter arrived, that the girl's years in that household had likely been difficult, but hearing the details confirmed so plainly stirred something fierce and protective in him, an instinct that had nothing to do with the fated bond he had felt his entire life, and everything to do with simple, human anger at the thought of anyone treating another person so poorly. She will never endure another day of that kind of treatment, Draven said quietly, once he had learned to speak again. Whatever happens when we arrive, I intend to ensure that much. Corin nodded, understanding the weight behind his king's words, though he said nothing further, allowing Draven the silence he seemed to need, as the fire burned low and the stars emerged overhead. The final 2 days of travel brought them steadily closer to the Voss estate, the diplomatic itinerary listing it as the last stop before the royal party's return north. Draven found sleep increasingly difficult as they drew nearer, the old dream visiting him each night with growing intensity. The girl within it now pausing longer than ever before, turning away, as though something on her end had shifted as well, though she could not have known why. They arrived at the outskirts of the Voss estate on a cool morning, the manor's pale stone walls visible from a considerable distance, framed by carefully tended gardens, and a wide gravel drive leading toward the main entrance. A messenger had been sent ahead the previous day, informing Lord Voss of the royal party's impending arrival, as part of the broader diplomatic tour, careful to frame the visit as a formal courtesy rather than anything more significant. Lord Voss himself waited at the entrance to greet them, dressed in his finest attire, his expression carefully composed into the practiced warmth of a man eager to please a visiting monarch. "Your Majesty," Lord Voss said, bowing deeply as Draven dismounted. "We are honored beyond words by your presence. Please, allow us to make you comfortable during your stay." Draven inclined his head politely, keeping his expression carefully neutral despite the tension coiling tightly beneath his composed exterior. "Lord Voss, I have heard much of your household standing in the southern provinces. I look forward to strengthening the ties between our territories during my stay." Lord Voss beamed at the diplomatic phrasing, clearly relieved that the visit appeared to be exactly what it claimed to be, and led the royal party into the grand entrance hall, where Lady Voss and Marisol waited to complete the formal welcome. "Your Majesty," Lady Voss said, curtsying elegantly, "we are so pleased to host you. Please, allow us to show you to your quarters, and we will arrange a formal dinner this evening to properly welcome you and your escort." Draven thanked them graciously, allowing himself to be led through the manor's halls while his eyes moved carefully over every detail, searching, though he did not yet fully understand the depth of his own urgency, for any sign of the girl who had occupied his thoughts for over a decade. He did not see her that first afternoon. The household servants remained largely out of sight during the formal welcome, occupied with the considerable preparations required to properly host a visiting king. Draven forced himself to be patient, attending a lengthy afternoon discussion with Lord Voss regarding trade routes and regional alliances, his mind only partially engaged with the conversation, the rest of his attention fixed on the low, persistent hum of anticipation building steadily within him. That evening's formal dinner brought the entire household together in the grand dining hall, an impressive display of the family's wealth arranged carefully to impress their royal guest. Draven sat at the head of the long table, Lord and Lady Voss on either side, Marisol seated nearby, clearly eager to make a favorable impression on the visiting monarch. "I understand your household employs a considerable staff," Draven said carefully, during a lull in the evening's conversation, keeping his tone casual despite the deliberate direction of his question. "Managing an estate of this size must require significant coordination." "Indeed, Your Majesty," Lord Voss replied smoothly. "We are fortunate to have a dedicated staff, several of whom have served our family for many years. I would be curious to see how such a household operates," Draven continued, careful to keep his tone light, conversational, betraying nothing of the urgency beneath it. "Perhaps a tour of the estate tomorrow, including the working areas, would help me better understand the practices of successful southern households." Lord Voss hesitated only briefly before nodding, unable to refuse such a request from a visiting king without appearing evasive. "Of course, Your Majesty. I would be happy to arrange a full tour tomorrow morning." Draven inclined his head in thanks, forcing himself to remain outwardly calm despite the fierce anticipation building within him. Tomorrow, he thought, allowing himself, for the first time in 11 years, to fully believe it. Tomorrow, after so many years of searching, he would finally see her. He retired to his quarters that evening earlier than the household expected, claiming fatigue from the long journey, though sleep proved elusive as he lay awake staring at the ceiling of the unfamiliar room, his mind replaying every detail Corin had gathered, every fragment of the dream that had haunted him since childhood, every year of searching that had led him to this single quiet estate in the southern provinces. Somewhere within these very walls, he thought, she was sleeping just as restlessly, unaware that tomorrow would change everything she had ever known about her own quiet, careful existence. Elira had no idea a king was sleeping under the same roof that night. News of the royal visit had reached the servant quarters only briefly the previous afternoon, and even then, the details had been vague, filtered through hurried instructions to prepare extra linens and additional meals for unnamed guests of importance. She had spent the entire day scrubbing floors in preparation, too exhausted by evening to think much about who exactly they were preparing for. Lyra Greta. She woke the next morning to Greta shaking her shoulder gently, an urgency in the older woman's manner that Alira had rarely seen before. "Up, quickly," Greta said. "The mistress wants every servant properly presentable this morning. There is to be a full tour of the estate, including the working areas. Apparently our guest wishes to see how the household truly operates." Alira sat up slowly, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. A tour of the servant quarters. That seems unusual for a guest. Unusual indeed, Greta agreed, already moving toward the door. But not our place to question it. Get dressed and come help in the kitchen. We have a great deal to prepare before midday. Alira dressed quickly, tying back her hair and smoothing the wrinkles from her gray dress as best she could, before making her way to the kitchen, where the household staff were already deep in preparations. The air buzzed with a nervous energy she had never witnessed among the usually subdued servants, whispered speculation passing between them about the identity of their important guest. "Some say it is a duke from the eastern provinces," one of the younger servants murmured to another, both of them polishing silverware with unusual care. "Others say it might be someone even more significant." Alira paid little attention to the gossip, focused instead on the tasks at hand, carrying trays of prepared ingredients between the pantry and the kitchen, helping Greta manage the considerable workload the morning demanded. It was well past mid-morning when she heard the sound of approaching footsteps and hushed voices in the hallway outside the kitchen, followed by Lord Voss's familiar tone, unusually formal and careful. "And this is our kitchen, Your Majesty, where our excellent staff prepare meals for the entire household." Alira froze for only a moment at the words Your Majesty, her mind struggling to process what they implied, before quickly returning to her task, keeping her head down as she had been trained to do whenever guests were present. She heard the group enter the kitchen behind her, Lord Voss continuing his explanation of the household's daily operations, his voice carrying the practiced warmth he reserved for anyone whose opinion mattered to him. She did not turn around. She had learned, over 3 years of service, that servants were meant to remain unseen during such moments, continuing their work quietly while important guests observed the household's operations from a respectful distance. She kept her eyes fixed on the ingredients in front of her, her hands moving through the familiar motions of her work, until a sudden, absolute stillness settled over the kitchen behind her. She felt it before she understood it, a strange, unfamiliar pull settling deep in her chest, as though something invisible had suddenly reached across the room and taken hold of her, gentle but undeniable. She turned, almost against her own will, her body responding to something her mind had not yet caught up to. And there, standing in the doorway of the kitchen beside Lord Voss, was a man she had never seen before, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in traveling clothes that nonetheless carried an unmistakable air of authority. His eyes met hers across the room, and the moment they did, Alira felt something inside her shift so completely that she nearly dropped the bowl she had been holding. The man had gone very still as well, his expression shifting from polite attentiveness to something far more intense, something that looked almost like disbelief, mixed with overwhelming relief. Lord Voss continued speaking beside him, oblivious to the sudden charge in the air. But the man was no longer listening, his gaze fixed entirely on Alira, as though he had forgotten anyone else existed in the room at all. "Your Majesty," Lord Voss said, noticing the sudden silence with a flicker of confusion. "Is something the matter?" The man did not answer immediately, his attention still fixed on Alira, who stood frozen in place, her heart pounding in a way she had never experienced before, an overwhelming, inexplicable pull drawing her toward him, even as every instinct trained into her over the past 3 years screamed at her to look away, to lower her eyes, to remain invisible as she always had. "That servant," the man said finally, his voice low and carefully controlled, though Alira could hear something trembling beneath its surface. "What is her name?" Lord Voss glanced toward Alira with visible surprise, clearly unaccustomed to a guest of such importance taking any interest in the household staff. "That is Alira, Your Majesty. She has served our household for several years now." The man, whom Alira now understood must be the very king mentioned in the whispered speculation among the servants, took a slow step further into the kitchen, his eyes never leaving her face. Alira remained frozen, uncertain what to do, uncertain what any of this meant, though the strange pull in her chest continued to grow stronger with every passing second. "Alira," the man repeated quietly, as though testing the sound of her name against something he had carried in his mind for a very long time. "May I see your wrist?" The room fell into absolute silence at the unusual request. Lord Voss's expression shifted from confusion to visible alarm, though he said nothing, unwilling to question a reigning king's request no matter how strange it seemed. Alira felt her pulse quicken further, old fear rising alongside the strange, undeniable pull she still could not explain. Slowly, With trembling hands, she pushed back her sleeve, revealing the pale crescent mark on the inside of her wrist that she had hidden for as long as she could remember. The man's breath caught audibly, his eyes fixed on the mark, something in his expression breaking open entirely, relief and disbelief and overwhelming emotion all crossing his features at once. 11 years, he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else in the room. 11 years, and I have finally found you. Alira stared at him, utterly bewildered, the strange pull in her chest intensifying with every word he spoke, though she still did not understand what any of it meant, only that something enormous and unstoppable had just begun, right there in the quiet kitchen where she had spent so many years trying desperately to remain unseen. The kitchen remained frozen in stunned silence for several long moments after Draven's words settled over the room. Lord Voss stared between the king and the servant girl he had barely acknowledged in 3 years, his mind visibly racing to understand what he had just witnessed. Marisol, who had accompanied the tour along with her parents, stood near the doorway with an expression of pure disbelief, her earlier boredom replaced entirely by something closer to alarm. "Your Majesty," Lord Voss said carefully, attempting to recover his composure. "I confess I do not fully understand. Is this girl known to you?" Draven did not immediately answer, his attention still entirely fixed on Alira, who stood with her sleeve still pushed back, revealing the mark that had just changed everything about her quiet, careful existence. He took another step closer, his voice gentler now, though the intensity in his eyes remained undiminished. "Alira," he said softly, "do you understand what this mark means? Has anyone ever explained it to you?" Alira shook her head slowly, still too overwhelmed to fully form words, the strange pull in her chest growing stronger with every passing second, an inexplicable sense of recognition toward a man she had never met in her life. "It is a bonding mark," Draven explained, his tone careful, patient, as though speaking to someone who might startle and flee if he moved too quickly. "A sign carried by those fated to be joined with someone of the northern royal bloodline. I have carried the counterpart to your mark since birth, though mine remains hidden beneath my clothing rather than visible like yours. I have spent 11 years searching for you, Alira, ever since I first began dreaming of a girl with exactly this mark, when I was still a child." Alira's mind reeled, the words settling over her slowly, disbelief warring with the undeniable pull she had felt the moment their eyes first met across the kitchen. "I do not understand," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was told this mark was something to hide, something shameful." Something dark passed across Draven's expression at her words, though his voice remained gentle when he responded. "Whoever told you that was wrong. This mark is not shameful. It is a sign of a bond most people spend their entire lives hoping to find, and never do." Lord Voss, sensing the situation shifting rapidly beyond his control, attempted to intervene with practiced smoothness. "Your Majesty, if this girl is important to you in some way, I assure you our household has cared for her well during her time here. She has always been treated fairly among our staff." Draven's gaze snapped toward Lord Voss with an intensity that made the older man visibly falter. "Fairly," Draven repeated, his voice suddenly cold in a way that filled the kitchen with tension. "I have received reports of her treatment in this household, reports of harsh conditions, unreasonable demands, and a distinct lack of basic kindness extended toward her over the past 3 years." Lord Voss paled visibly, glancing toward his wife and daughter, both of whom appeared equally shaken by the sudden shift in the king's demeanor. "Your Majesty, I assure you, any difficulties Alira may have experienced were simply the ordinary demands of household service, nothing more." "Ordinary demands," Draven said quietly, though his tone carried an unmistakable edge now, "do not typically involve a servant hiding a part of herself out of learned fear, nor do they involve years of treatment severe enough that reports of it reached my own court from villagers 2 provinces away." Marisol, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke, her voice unsteady. "Your Majesty, I am certain there has been some misunderstanding. Alira has always been treated according to her position within our household." Draven turned toward her slowly, and Alira, watching the exchange with growing disbelief, saw something shift in his expression, a controlled restraint that spoke of considerable effort to remain composed. "Her position," he repeated. "Tell me, does her position typically include being denied meals, assigned punishing extra labor without cause, and spoken to with the kind of contempt no household should extend toward anyone in their care?" No one in the room answered. Alira felt her face flush with a complicated mixture of embarrassment and something else entirely, something that felt almost like validation. Hearing the years of quiet hardship she had endured, finally spoken aloud in front of the very people who had caused it. Draven turned back toward her then, his expression softening once more as he addressed her directly, seemingly unconcerned with the stunned household around them. Alira, I understand this is overwhelming, and I do not wish to frighten you further, but I must ask, are you willing to leave this household? I can offer you a life entirely different from the one you have known here, one where you will never again be made to feel less than you are. Alira looked between Draven and the Voss family, her mind still struggling to process the enormity of everything unfolding around her. 3 years of careful, quiet survival, and now, suddenly, an escape from it all being offered by a king who claimed to have been searching for her since childhood. I do not know what any of this means for my life, she said finally, her voice trembling slightly, though something steadier had begun to settle beneath the uncertainty. But I do not wish to remain in this household any longer. Draven's expression eased into something close to relief at her words, though he remained careful, patient, clearly unwilling to rush her through a decision as significant as this one. Then you need not remain here another day, he said gently. Whatever you decide about everything else I have explained, you will leave this household with me, today, and you will never again be subjected to the treatment you have endured here. Lord Voss opened his mouth as though to protest, some instinct toward the debt Alira's family had supposedly repaid through her years of service rising within him. But a single sharp look from Draven silenced him immediately, the full weight of royal authority settling over the room in a way that left no room for argument. Alira looked down at the mark on her wrist, still visible where her sleeve remained pushed back, and felt, for the first time in 3 long years, something she had almost forgotten how to recognize, a small, fragile, uncertain flicker of hope. News of the morning's events spread through the Voss estate faster than anyone could have anticipated, whispered from servant to servant until every corner of the household understood, in broad strokes if not full detail, that the quiet girl who had spent 3 years scrubbing their floors was somehow connected to the visiting king in a manner none of them had ever imagined possible. Greta found Alira an hour later in the small servant quarters, gathering the few belongings she owned into a modest bag, her hands trembling slightly as she folded the worn gray dress she had worn every day for 3 years. I heard, Greta said quietly, standing in the doorway. The whole household has heard. Is it true? Are you truly leaving with him? Alira looked up, her expression a complicated mixture of disbelief and cautious hope. I do not fully understand what any of this means, Greta. He says I carry some kind of bond to him, something from old stories I never believed were real. He says the mark on my wrist is proof of it. Greta crossed the small room and took Alira's hands gently in her own, an unusual display of affection from the normally reserved cook. I have heard the old stories too, child, though I never expected to witness one unfolding within these walls. Whatever happens next, know that you deserve every good thing that comes to you now. You have endured far more than any young woman should have to. Alira felt tears gathering unexpectedly at Greta's words, the first genuine kindness she had received from anyone in this household besides the older cook herself. Thank you, she said softly, for everything you have done for me these past years. Greta squeezed her hands once more before stepping back, allowing Alira to finish gathering her few belongings. Go now. Whatever waits for you beyond these walls, it cannot possibly be worse than what you have already survived here. Alira made her way back through the manor toward the entrance hall, where Draven waited alongside Corin and the small escort of guards who had traveled with them. Lord and Lady Voss stood nearby as well, their expressions carefully composed despite the obvious tension still lingering from the morning's revelations. Marisol was notably absent, having retreated to her private quarters shortly after the confrontation in the kitchen. Are you ready? Draven asked gently, as Alira approached, his eyes searching her face carefully, clearly attentive to any sign of hesitation or fear. I believe so, Alira said, her voice steadier now than it had been earlier that morning, though uncertainty still lingered beneath her words. Though I confess I still do not fully understand what awaits me. We will explain everything along the journey north, Draven assured her. There is no need to understand it all at once. Lord Voss stepped forward then, attempting one final appeal despite the clear futility of the effort. Your Majesty, surely some arrangement can be made regarding the remaining debt that brought Alira into our household originally. It seems only fair that... Draven's expression turned cold once more, cutting off Lord Voss's words with a single sharp look. Any debt owed by Alira's family will be settled by the crown, and settled fairly, unlike the arrangement that brought her into this household in the first place. As for your household's future dealings with the crown, I suggest you consider very carefully how you conduct yourselves toward those in your service going forward. Reports of cruelty toward household staff will not be received favorably by a king who has now witnessed firsthand exactly what such reports describe. Lord Voss paled further at the implicit warning, understanding immediately that his household's reputation and standing within the broader kingdom now hung precariously in the balance, dependent entirely on how they conducted themselves in the years ahead. Draven turned back toward Alira then, offering his arm with a gentleness that surprised her, given the authority he had just displayed only moments before. "Shall we begin the journey north? I promise you, whatever uncertainty you feel now, it will ease with time." Alira accepted his arm carefully, still adjusting to the strange, undeniable pull she felt whenever she stood near him, an instinct she was only beginning to understand as the fated bond he had described. They made their way out to the courtyard, where horses waited to begin the long journey back toward the capital. As they rode away from the Voss estate, Alira glanced back once at the pale stone walls that had confined her for 3 long years, feeling an unexpected lightness settle over her chest as the manor grew smaller in the distance. Whatever waited for her in the northern kingdom, whatever this fated bond truly meant for the rest of her life, she felt certain, for the first time in years, that it would be better than what she had left behind. Corin rode alongside them for much of the journey, occasionally sharing stories of the northern kingdom to help ease Alira's uncertainty about the life awaiting her there. Draven, for his part, remained attentive throughout the journey, careful never to press her with too many questions at once, allowing her the space to process everything unfolding around her at whatever pace felt manageable. "You do not have to decide everything about our future today," Draven told her one evening, as they made camp along the road north. "The bond between us is real, and I believe you feel it as strongly as I do, but I would never wish to rush you into anything before you are ready. Take whatever time you need to understand what this means for your own life." Alira looked at him carefully across the campfire, studying the man who had spent 11 years searching for her, who had shown more genuine consideration for her feelings in a single day than she had experienced in 3 years under the Voss household's roof. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for giving me that time." Draven smiled gently, something warm and patient in his expression. "You deserve nothing less, Alira, and I intend to spend however long it takes ensuring you understand that fully." As the days passed and the northern mountains grew steadily closer, Alira found herself, slowly and cautiously, beginning to believe that the life awaiting her at the end of this journey might finally be one where she was valued rather than merely tolerated, cared for rather than simply used, and free, at long last, to be seen as more than an invisible servant moving quietly through someone else's household. The city of Ashwin came into view on the 12th day of their journey, its dark stone towers rising above the surrounding forest, catching the late afternoon light in a way that made Alira slow her horse involuntarily, taking in the sight of the kingdom she had never expected to see, let alone call her home. "It is beautiful," she said quietly, and Draven, riding beside her, felt something in his chest ease at the wonder in her voice, so different from the careful, guarded tone she had carried when they first met in that kitchen so many days ago. "It will be yours as much as mine, in time," Draven said gently, "though I know that is a great deal to adjust to all at once." As they approached the castle gates, word had already spread ahead of them, carried by riders sent in advance to prepare the household for their arrival. A modest crowd had gathered near the entrance, drawn by rumors that the king had finally returned from his long search, though few among them understood the full details of what exactly he had found. Eldon waited at the gates, his expression shifting from careful composure to open relief the moment he saw Alira riding beside Draven, the crescent mark on her wrist now visible where she had grown gradually more comfortable letting her sleeve rest naturally against her skin rather than pulling it protectively over the mark as she once had. "Your Majesty," Eldon said, bowing deeply before turning his attention to Alira with unmistakable warmth. "And you must be the young woman we have searched for these many years. Welcome, truly, to Ashwin." Alira dismounted carefully, still adjusting to the strange sensation of being welcomed so openly, so genuinely, after years of learning to expect exactly the opposite from those around her. "Thank you," she said softly. "I confess I am still adjusting to everything that has happened these past weeks." "That is entirely understandable," Eldon replied kindly. "Take whatever time you need. The kingdom has waited 11 years for this moment. It can certainly wait a little longer for you to feel settled." The following weeks brought a gradual, careful transformation to Alira's life, one that unfolded slowly rather than all at once, exactly as Draven had promised during their journey north. She was given her own private chambers within the castle, filled with warmth and comfort unlike anything she had known during her years at the Voss estate. She was assigned attendants who treated her with genuine respect rather than the careful distance she had grown accustomed to as a servant herself. At first, The adjustment proved difficult in ways she had not fully anticipated. Years of careful, guarded behavior had become deeply ingrained habits, and she found herself instinctively lowering her eyes when castle staff addressed her, instinctively reaching to complete tasks herself rather than allowing attendants to assist her, instinctively bracing for harsh words that never came. Draven noticed these lingering habits with quiet patience, never rushing her, never expressing frustration at how long the adjustment seemed to take. Instead, he made a point of spending time with her each day, walking through the castle gardens together, sharing stories of the kingdom's history, gradually helping her understand the life that now stretched ahead of her. "You do not need to earn kindness here," he told her one afternoon, as they walked together through gardens far more beautiful than anything she had tended at the Voss estate, though never for her own enjoyment. "It is simply yours, freely given, without any expectation attached." Alira looked at him carefully, something in her expression softening in a way that spoke of slow, careful healing rather than sudden transformation. "It will take time," she admitted, "to fully believe that." "I have all the time in the world," Draven replied simply. 11 years of searching taught me patience, if nothing else." Over the following months, Alira gradually began to trust the new life unfolding around her, allowing herself, bit by bit, to believe that the kindness extended toward her was genuine, rather than temporary. She formed friendships among the castle staff, discovered a genuine talent for gardening that Draven encouraged wholeheartedly, and slowly began to understand the depth of the bond that had drawn her and Draven together across so many years and so many miles. Their formal joining ceremony took place nearly a year after that first meeting in the Voss estate kitchen, a celebration that drew visitors from across the northern territories, eager to witness the long-awaited conclusion of a search that had become something of legend throughout the kingdom during the years it continued. Alira stood before the gathered crowd that day, dressed in fine clothing unlike anything she had ever imagined wearing during her years of quiet servitude, the crescent mark on her wrist now displayed openly, rather than hidden away in shame. Draven stood beside her, his expression carrying the same quiet certainty she had come to know so well over the months since their first meeting. 11 years ago, Draven said, addressing the gathered crowd, his voice carrying easily across the courtyard, "I began dreaming of a girl I had never met, carrying a mark I did not yet understand. Many believed over the years that I chased nothing more than fantasy, but I never stopped believing she was real, and I never stopped searching for her." He turned toward Alira then, taking her hand gently in his own. "Today, I stand before all of you with the proof that patience and faith are sometimes rewarded exactly as we hope. Alira has endured more hardship than anyone should ever have to bear, and yet she stands here today, not as someone defined by that hardship, but as someone ready to build an entirely new life, one where she will never again know the kind of treatment she once endured." Alira felt tears gathering as she listened to his words, looking out at the gathered crowd, at the kingdom that had welcomed her so openly despite everything she had once believed about her own worth. She thought of Greta, whom Draven had arranged to bring north to serve in the royal kitchens at Alira's own request, one of the few connections to her old life that she had chosen to keep. She thought of the years of quiet servitude, the careful silence, the constant fear of drawing attention to herself. None of that defined her any longer. "I spent 3 years believing I was meant to remain invisible," Alira said, her voice carrying clearly across the courtyard despite her own surprise at finding the courage to speak before such a large gathering. "I believed the mark on my wrist was something to hide, something shameful. I know now that I was wrong, about all of it. I am grateful, beyond words, for the chance to build a new life here, surrounded by people who have shown me nothing but genuine kindness since the day I arrived." The crowd erupted into warm applause, and Alira felt Draven's hand tighten gently around her own, a quiet reassurance that the life ahead of them, whatever challenges it might bring, would be built on genuine partnership, rather than the harsh servitude she had known before. As the celebration continued late into the evening, Alira found herself standing quietly near the castle gardens, looking up at the same stars that had once watched over her narrow cot in the Voss estate servant quarters, feeling, for the first time in her entire life, that she was exactly where she belonged. Draven found her there eventually, slipping his arm around her shoulders as they stood together beneath the night sky. "Any regrets?" he asked softly. Alira leaned into him, feeling the warmth and safety that had slowly become familiar over the past year, thinking of everything she had endured, and everything that now lay ahead of her. "None at all," she said finally. "For the first time in my life I feel completely free." And beneath the vast northern sky, surrounded by a kingdom that had waited 11 years to welcome her home, Alira finally allowed herself to believe, fully and without hesitation, that she was no longer the invisible servant girl sold to settle a debt. She was Alira, queen of the Northern Territories, chosen not because anyone demanded it of her, but because a fated bond, patient and unwavering, had refused to let her be forgotten.